welcome. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and the one person who is bringing joy to the messy and complicated world of news that we live in, I hope you'll agree, is Mark St. Andrew, who has kicked off this thinking with the perfect song. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Indeed, let's make lots of money. I am going to figure out, I hope in the course of this hour, what's a reasonable amount of money to make? And I think that's the reason why this feels like a really difficult question. And even in the framing of it, we struggled, right? Who are the COVID profiteers? Because there's a difference between making a profit in a pandemic and profiteering, but it is, of course, just a question of degree. And it's therefore one that people with different points of view are going to judge differently. And, you know, we've recently reopened our newsroom, and it means that some people who've not been here before, if you haven't, it's a really simple system of thinking. It's like an editorial news meeting. This one is kind of as real as they get, because I actually really don't know what I think. Part of me feels a little guilty about even hosting it, in the sense that I feel as though it's going to be a free-for-all for beating up on kind of pharma companies, when the reality is a lot of those people have worked really hard to try and do the right thing. So how do we make sure that we have a proper conversation around this? It requires us to do what I hope a thinking does, which is invite everyone to weigh in with their point of view. So we have a loosely enforced rule. I think many people joining us online will know it too, which is no questions. What we really want is to hear what you think. Raise your digital hand, put something in the chat, and we will. I see that Gopesh Pathak agrees with me that this is a genius music choice, Mark. Let's make sure that we get as many points of view as possible. And to give you a sense of where it goes, this is one of those thinkings where we really hope we'll come out with at least a lead or two for a story. So my colleague, Kerry Thomas, an editor and partner here, you can see him up on the screen, delivered one of our slow newscasts last week, Pfizer's War, which was looking at one particular aspect of this. We do think that the whole way our healthcare system is a subject for many more stories, so we'd love to see where it goes from here. We're joined by Kerry. We're joined, Raj, thank you also for joining us, Raj Tamatharam, who's written a really punchy, the way we like them, thoughtful and punchy, slow view for us this week. I'm hoping that Fatima Hassan is going to join us. She may not have quite reached us yet, but here we've got Billy and Max. And listen, thank you both very much for joining us. Max Lawson, I'm going to come to you in a moment.
Alex Maitland, actually, I've got to correct you. There was a change halfway through the day yesterday.
That's really. I am not. Yes,
I've got a lot more hair than Max.
Really. That's already. You won't. I'm sure appreciate that. Listen, forgive me, Alex. I'm sorry, I didn't realise that. Alex, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but you are still from Oxfam, and you're still one of the authors of the vaccine trade lottery. Did you? Okay, good. All right. Well, that's good. Forgive me now. I'm really blushing. But Billy Kember, I do know it's much easier because we used to work together at the time, so I can actually ID him. Billy, I suppose I really would like to start with you. As you may have guessed, Billy is the author of this fascinating book, not least because, of course, it started long before the pandemic, the work on it, and it was about the structure of the pharma industry. It wasn't about, you know, pandemic profiteering. So can we start there? Because the book makes quite a savage analysis of what's sick in the pharmaceutical industry itself. Mm-hmm. So why don't you start pre-pandemic and then tell us how you think that read across into the pandemic?
So yeah, as you say, this book pretty much entirely predates the pandemic. It does touch on what's happened, but it's really about how the pharmaceutical industry first emerged, how the modern industry really emerged in the wake of the Second World War and the development of manufacturing at a mass scale for penicillin, and how, if you like, it sort of lost its moral compass over the ensuing years, particularly with a focus from the 1980s onwards, when the industry became much more financially focused. And then the book explores the ramifications that had for the types of drugs we get, the prices we pay, and how accessible they are. And I suppose that speaks to the sort of central question which you raise on profiteering and what's a fair price, which is the unique nature of the pharmaceutical industry. It is not an industry like any other. It is not like selling car parts or selling tin soup, because the products that they sell are life-changing or life-saving. And so what sort of moral responsibility, corporate responsibility do you have beyond simply placating your shareholders when that is the situation?
And Billy, what do you say to those people who, in corporate pharma, would say, look, we have never seen the pace and range of innovation in healthcare that we have in the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. People hate the profits, but they really, really, thrive thanks to the profits. By which I mean longer life expectancies, pushing back the, boundaries of what we thought was feasible in healthcare, all because that profit motive has encouraged biotech, new inventions and new innovations in healthcare. They argue that the system that you think is rotten is actually the best we've ever had.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things there. I'm certainly not arguing that there shouldn't be a profit element and that there shouldn't be a profit incentive. It's not arguing for a sort of a communist approach. But I think actually when you talk about the last 30 years, the real boom period of pharmaceutical innovation was in the 60s and 70s, and there were waves and waves of new classes of drugs. There was then quite a dip in productivity in terms of new treatments and the spending per drug to develop these treatments in the 90s and early noughties, which I would argue is in part because they were too financially focused. They were killing projects because they didn't think those projects would be profitable enough, and then realizing belatedly that actually with science you can't always predict where things will end up, and serendipity and the process of scientific exploration can lead you to end results that are very beneficial but aren't what you were necessarily aiming for when you set out. I think sometimes the sort of profit at all cost mindset was at the cost of innovation we might have had.
And what would you, if you were just in the sort of spirit of, okay, well, I'm coming and I'm pitching a story, the sort of one story of one person, one company, one drug that would best tell that?
So there's a narrative that the book follows of a man, a Canadian businessman called Mark Thompson, who is a lawyer who goes to work in the pharmaceutical industry and decides in the early 2010s to set up his own company. And he decides that he doesn't need to do any research and development into new medicines, that's far too expensive and far too risky. And instead, he will buy up the rights to old medicines and then will ensure that he's the only person supplying those drugs, and then we'll jack up the cost. And that model that he followed for some years very successfully, and that lots of other companies have followed, is a relic of the wider changes in the industry. That was possible because R&D had become very expensive and not very productive, and so investors were prepared to accept the argument that it wasn't worth doing, even though from the outside the whole purpose of the industry is surely there to develop new medicines. And they were prepared to accept his pricing strategies because that's what everyone was doing, from the multinationals down.
And do you think, because the Mark Thompson story, which begins kind of, doesn't it, in Canada, the thing that's struck me that's fascinating about it is that he believes, or certainly seems to believe, that he goes into this with really good intentions. And how do you answer those people who say, actually, look at pharma industry, actually that's true across the industry. People think that the industry is structured for a good public outcome.
Yeah, I think there's, I don't think we can perhaps paint with a broad brush on that one. I mean, it's certainly true that there are lots and lots of people that work in the pharmaceutical industry, particularly the scientists, who are good people doing good work with good values and doing it for a good purpose. But it doesn't. It's about leadership. It's about strategic decisions that really affect this sort of thing.
I guess what I'm wondering is, and you touch on this in the book, is it in the end your argument that's fine to make a profit, but there needs to be a regulated margin for pharmaceutical companies? How do you distinguish between profit and profiteers?
So one of the things I argue for is something that we have in the UK, which is a cost effectiveness analysis, and that is using economics to define the value of a drug, and then working out what we as a society are prepared to pay for 1 month of extra life or whatever it may be, and restoring a degree of rational decision-making to the prices we pay. Because one of the consequences of these changes is that in certain categories of drugs, you can almost set your own price. The sky's the limit, particularly in oncology and in drug treatments for rare diseases. And that's not because necessarily those are the most clinically useful or the most beneficial for society. It's because basically of a quirk in the US healthcare system, which means doctors are prepared to prescribe those drugs, and patients on those drugs have normally already tapped out any deductible or contribution they need to make to insurance, and therefore are willing to try everything. So I argue for sort of a return to the degree of rationalism. The other thing that I think we've lost that needs to be restored and would go a long way to fixing a lot of these problems is essentially this social contract that developed in the wake of the Second World War, where we have a fixed-term patent, a monopoly license for companies to make their money back from research and development. And then when that term ends after a defined period, you have lots of competition and cheap generics, and those drugs become effectively gifts to society in perpetuity. And it's that cycle that creates the funds for the fresh innovation. But what we've had in the last 20 and 30 years is a huge amount of essentially dirty tricks to extend patent life, to keep generics out of the market through backroom deals, and to distort that agreement. So that's where you have the problems with old medicines and the pricing of those drugs. It's also where you have problems where you're paying for many years longer than originally envisaged for new drugs. And that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem because, for technical reasons, a lot of the biologic medicines we get today are much harder to genericize.
So can we make the link then, Billy, with the pandemic? And I'm going to come, if I might, to Kerry and Raj, and to you too, Alex. Do you think that you're seeing the same pattern of, if you like, innovation exploitation in the pandemic from pharma companies as you have in the last 20, 30 years?
I think to an extent. I think there has been a degree of sort of moral responsibility, and certainly from AstraZeneca. I mean, that wasn't, if they wanted to do a deal with Oxford, with the Oxford University researchers, the only terms in which that was available was on this basis that they sell it on a not-for-profit basis during the pandemic. But no, I think a lot of the companies have looked to maximise profits and have benefited from some of the other structural problems that we haven't got into yet, but around public funding and the lack of restrictions applied to that.
And well, I'm going to bring Kerry in a moment. Kerry, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, hi.
So can I ask you, what do you make of what Billy's saying? Because part of me listens to all of this and thinks, actually, what we're talking about is nothing to do with pharma. It's about different worldviews. You know, you may take a view about capitalism, which is, look, if you put the money up to invest, then you should be able to reap the rewards of that investment. Or you might take a view that, look, whichever way you deploy capital, you have certain social responsibilities, and they should constrain the extent to which you can make money. This goes way beyond pharma.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think we obviously took a view, or I took a view in starting this speech, which was that I didn't start from the position that I was opposed to anybody making money from the pandemic. I started with that question that you mentioned of degree rather than absolutism. So, which is already a view, because there are plenty of people out there who would come at that from a different perspective. I think that there's a really interesting way of thinking about this, which is, or kind of forcing mechanism for thinking about it, which is to ask yourself, who invented the mRNA vaccine? We know Pfizer and Moderna will be the two great beneficiaries of it. Pfizer obviously bought the technology in from BioNTech, so it wasn't something they developed in-house. They bought that in, but actually, that's not the answer either. The answer goes back to 1987 in a lab in California, when a guy called Robert Malone stumbles across the fact that mRNA can be used as a kind of drug, and it then passes through countless hands: Harvard, University of Wisconsin, other universities in California. And so the answer to that question of who invented the mRNA vaccine is that there was a huge dose of public funding involved. There were a huge number of publicly funded researchers involved. And at the very end of it, you have a single pharma company that is taking a quantifiable risk at the end of that long process, in pursuit of what we, I think at the end of that podcast, came to think were quite disproportionate rewards. And it's that which takes you back to the question of degree, which I think is the most difficult and the most interesting sort of framing for this conversation.
Can I say one thing that Billy said was he touched upon the cost. What is it called, Billy? Called cost effective.
Cost effectiveness, they're called health technology assessments. So you're looking to calculate what is the value of this drug in health gains compared to the existing standard of treatment, and what is that worth in financial terms?
All right. So one of the things that came up in Kerry's research for Pfizer's war was I asked Kerry, what's the actual price per dose for each of these different vaccines? And do you want to say what we found out about that?
Well, just that it's really hard to find out. We haven't found out. I think we're going to keep trying to find out. But what I got was guesses. So there are the best guess that people in this country had was that we might be paying $26 a dose for Pfizer, and that we might be paying $5 to $7 a dose for AstraZeneca, and that Johnson & Johnson, Moderna might be around the high teens or 20. But everybody who told me that acknowledged that they didn't know for sure. At COVAX, the international agency that was set up to try to get vaccine doses to low and medium income countries, they think that Pfizer particularly have been determined not to sell directly to them because in COVAX they think Pfizer don't want COVAX to become a market maker. That COVAX obviously in the fullness of time will have real clout just through the sheer number of vaccines that it's purchasing. And so one of the reasons that they thought that Pfizer was steering clear of them, and the many doses of Pfizer vaccine that are now going to COVAX are going to go via the US government. So there'll be a level of opaqueness that comes in there. So the Pfizer will sell at what they call cost to the US government, which will pass those doses on to COVAX, but COVAX won't know what the price was that was paid. They'll just receive them from the US government. So I think that kind of the lack of transparency around pricing is something which it's easy to see will play very well for the vaccine companies. I'm struggling to hear the advantage to us.
But I have to say, I'm completely flabbergasted by this. I know it's sort of like one of those things I don't understand. I don't understand how it's possible that you can have, and this is the reason I raise it, Billy, is that in a moment like this, you can find out the cost of Crossrail, and you can find out the cost of X or Y number of other public services, which are very, very hard to interpret or understand. I can't understand why pharmaceutical companies who are providing drugs in a pandemic aren't required to tell the government, aka, and then the public, what the price is per dose. What's the defense for not telling?
Well, we asked the Department of Health last week to tell us how much we the British people were paying for doses, and they said they'd signed a confidentiality agreement with the vaccine manufacturers that precluded them from telling us. So they cited commercial confidentiality as their rationale. It doesn't make any sense, does it, James?
Whose interests are defended by that or protected by that commercial confidentiality?
Yeah, well, clearly it serves extremely well to protect the interests of the vaccine manufacturers, and it stands in real contrast to what we're used to in this country. Is at least we set up the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence in 1999, I think, to measure the effectiveness of drugs against their price and to reach a judgment about the value to the public purse. And it seems really hard to set this against that custom and practice that we've had for 22 years now. Especially when we announce things like the fact that Pfizer will be used for all the booster doses in this country, and no one else can quite understand why it is that we've gone with Pfizer, unless you've got some way of calibrating the benefits of Pfizer so that it's worth paying astronomically more for Pfizer as a booster than we would be for AstraZeneca.
I mean, at a cautious estimate, 4 to 5 times more.
a cautious estimate for certainly COVAX think that they're getting vaccines when they're told it costs. They assume that the cost to them is about a quarter of what it is to a developed country. Yeah.
And if there's commercial confidentiality, Kerry, is there any suggestion that there are also other clauses in the contracts that pharmaceutical companies? So, for example, is it possible that you say, look, we'll sell you X number of doses, but when it comes to boosters 6 months down the line, you have to use by X number more of our doses? Do we know whether there are any of those clauses in any of those contracts, or that's also commercial confidentiality?
I think it probably would be wrapped up under the same cloak, wouldn't it? But I certainly didn't come across anything firm like that. We did come across, I was told by one person who really ought to know, but I couldn't stand it up with a second source, that Pfizer was inserting into its contracts with the UK government clauses that prevented government agencies publicising any problems with the Pfizer vaccine if they arose. So there's certainly a suggestion that there are quite a number of clauses underneath the main contract that could again be useful for the company, not for us.
And sorry, Kerry, what did the government or PHE say about that?
They denied that.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of the loose ends within the podcast that I still need to tie.
Right, I do want to make sure other people come in, but I'd love to hear from Alex, because Alex, before we get into the sort of the great vaccine robbery, can we just start from where Kerry was? Because you put, I don't know whether everyone saw it, this was a report from Oxfam in the summer which looked at, basically overpaying country by country, particularly because of, and it's particularly around Pfizer and Moderna that you look at. But how did you get around this issue of not necessarily knowing exactly what the price per dose was?
Yeah, so spending a lot of time trying to figure out from different sources how much governments are paying. And this is one of the greatest frustrations, is the lack of transparency by the pharmaceutical companies, and the fact that the contracts are being called commercially sensitive. The reason for that is so they can negotiate higher prices. They talk about different tiered systems, but this is a negotiation between the pharmaceutical company, who has all the power in these negotiations, and governments increasingly desperate to get hold of very finite supplies of vaccines. So there's obviously people within governments and civil servants who are very frustrated by the fact that they can't release these figures, and so they leak them. There's the European Union leaks online prices. Uganda, the UK through the Times actually has found prices, and you can also kind of see the prices overall by looking at Pfizer and Moderna's annual statements. So we know that it's probably, on average, government's probably paying about $16 a dose, but just by looking at the number of vaccines they've sold and dividing that by the profit line they put on it. But the interesting thing for us is how far disconnected that is from the true cost of actually developing mRNA vaccines. It's not a particularly expensive vaccine to make, even though they cost upwards of $20 when they're sold. Public Citizen with the Imperial College of London estimate that Pfizer is something like $1.19 a dose, which stands in far contrast from what they're charging governments to make. And so,
by the way, I read that. I didn't exactly understand how that calculation is made. Is that total research investment across the entire number of Pfizer-BioNTech doses?
So the research has already been paid for by governments. $100 billion worth of investment has gone into vaccines and into therapeutics, something like $9 billion on the mRNA for Pfizer and Moderna alone. And so the research and development costs, we don't know what Pfizer and Moderna have spent on that, because they refuse to publish those figures. But the cost for $1.20 would be to take the vaccine as it was now, creating a generic version effectively in regional hubs around the world, and creating enough to vaccinate the world.
So that's a production cost. You're talking really about a production cost.
Well, we're not including the research and development, but including the staff costs, and the material and everything like that.
And I think any pharmaceutical executive would say, but that's just not fair. That's like sort of talking about the distribution cost of a Netflix movie. The real cost is actually the cost of the R&D and the development and the the false starts and all of that. So,
and I completely agree with you. If it wasn't for the fact that the investment had come from
but it wasn't
the
all
public
of it.
sector.
I mean, a lot of the BioNTech investment was not funded out of public money. It wasn't out of government
Well, the
money.
underlying technology for it, as we heard, came mainly from universities and public sector. The AstraZeneca vaccine, 98%. The underlying technology was 98% funded through Oxford University through public money.
And the Pfizer people would say, but hang on a second, that's exactly our distinction. This was a university-funded, a publicly funded piece of research. Ours was a private sector. We didn't take any public money. You may say the mRNA infrastructure was, publicly researched, but the actual COVID-19 vaccine was privately researched. We developed it. We were the first company in the world to develop it. And kind of that work is not seen in that calculation.
Yeah, and if they were able to, if they published the figures on what they spent on research and development and actually break that down, then I'd be happy to listen to that. And there are systems through the intellectual property sharing through CTAP where Pfizer, Moderna, any company would be able to, if they shared their technology and IP, they'd be able to get a return on the investments which they'd put in the first place. But because they're refusing to engage in that, then.
And so, Alex, I guess because I want to come to some of the kind of jaw-dropping things that you find in the report. But how do you deal with So when we call a big pharma company, it can be quite frustrating, right? And you don't necessarily get an answer. I imagine when you're Oxfam and you're calling, it's even harder, right? Because they think that almost from the standing start, Oxfam is suspicious, if not downright critical, of big pharmaceutical companies. So how do you actually make sure that the research you've got chimes with the views and version of facts that these pharmaceutical companies have?
I mean, in the same way that, you're probably used to as a journalist, we go through the opportunity to comment process. We have personal relations with people who work for these companies. We've got an upcoming publication in a few weeks' time. And so yesterday I was talking to the AstraZeneca team about the research and going through the figures that we had. And we use multiple sources for the data that we look at. So when we're talking about things like the pricing, it's so difficult because it's reliant on leaks from government officials, and so that's very disconnected.
Yeah.
And if it's published in a publication like the Times, then it's something that we have to take, and maybe with a bit of pinch of salt, we look at different sources. But it's nothing against the Times at all. It's just if you have 26, like the Times the other day came out with a number for £26, I think it was, for the mRNA vaccine, and the BBC had something which was maybe £5 cheaper.
Yeah.
And so how do you reconcile those two numbers? It's it's very difficult.
But I guess there's a kind of deeper question here, which is how do we actually find a forum where people like Oxfam, who are going to come at it with a point of view, and people like Pfizer, who are going to come at it with a different point of view, actually get together? Is there a place where you feel as though
I'd like to see that through like the World Health Organization and through, the World Trade Organization at the moment has proposals for IP sharing, which is supported by over 100 countries worldwide. And the World Health Organization has, as I say, a technology sharing platform, which has invited all these organizations to. If anything, Oxfam shouldn't really be involved in those conversations, I don't think. We can highlight the injustices and the inequalities which exist, but the World Health Organization and these multilateral organizations really should be the ones who are talking to Pfizer and the other companies. And as I understand it, these companies refusing to engage.
So can you say the reason why I thought that the work that you did was so eye-catching was, and you see it in the chat actually, there's something that's been really frustrating about the argument around COVID profiteering in the UK, is that it's sort of Matt Hancock's mate in the pub, and it feels as though those contracts are really small beer by comparison with some of the things that you write about. I think you write about a kind of $375 million, excess paid by Colombia, or a kind of $170+ million excess paid by South Africa. How do you calculate that? And when you put it to the companies, how do they explain it?
Oh, well, so we took the figures, which we believe that that Pfizer and Moderna have charged the UK for the vaccine, and as we've heard, it's quite hard. But we took the lower end of the estimates to be conservative, and then compared that against the public citizens' estimates for how much it would cost to the $1.19 a dose, and then you can see the extra amount beyond. Which has been paid, which is enough for the equivalent of £1,000 bonus for everyone who works in the NHS, for example.
But even COVAX wouldn't apply that methodology. Even COVAX, which is there to provide vaccines for low middle income countries, would say, look, we realise we have to buy bulk, and we're not necessarily going to buy bulk at that public citizen price. We're going to buy bulk at what is agreed between COVAX and Pfizer, Moderna, at a quote-unquote cost. So how does that justify these numbers?
Well, this is based on those numbers are not imagining that it's Pfizer and Moderna who are just producing this vaccine, as if the intellectual property and the technological know-how was available to all. And it may mean that any country within the World Health Organization's kind of approved list would be able to make the manufacture of the vaccines themselves. And so we're not asking just Pfizer and Moderna to be manufacturing the vaccine. I think this is where one of the biggest problems has been in vaccine inequality around the world, is that we've put too much faith into a small number of companies to vaccinate the whole world. And to be fair, they've managed, so far, almost half the world's population is vaccinated, but those are predominantly in high income and upper middle income countries. Less than 2% of people in low-income countries have been vaccinated, and that's a direct result of these power imbalances which exist within the system. And so, freeing the IP, the technological sharing, is going to be the key thing to not only reducing the prices and getting it down to less than a couple of dollars for a dose, but also meaning that people all around the world have access to these amazing vaccines.
Well, I'm going to come to my colleagues Matt and Lara on this, because I don't know exactly where kind of the judgment should fall on pharma versus COVAX versus political leadership. But can I bring in, if you don't mind, just bring in Raj. Raj, what do you make of this conversation? Because obviously, we're trying to understand where the market economy works equitably and frankly where it doesn't. And what's your read on that?
Very big question, James. And if you look at, say, the pricing of insulin in the USA, it's really clear the market economy doesn't work on even basic drugs. My focus, though, has been very much on the pandemic and the extreme inequality of vaccine access. Alex just spoke about the fact that less than 2% of people in Africa have been vaccinated, and that includes very high-risk groups, medical doctors, nurses, healthcare workers. And this really is a stupid way to try to handle a global, tautology, but a pandemic. It's when you have the high likelihood of further variants, which may be like the Delta variant, not very responsive, or maybe even there's the possibility of a kind of doomsday variant, which may be completely escaping vaccine control. It's in the interests of the international community to make sure that there is a very rapid vaccination of the global population as quickly as possible. And I think in that particular situation, it's really important that the pharmaceutical industry, and I would argue its key investors who are benefiting from the situation, to ensure that vaccines are made available in a way which is going to allow rapid coverage. And that means production in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It's not going to work and it hasn't worked by trying to supply those continents from once the rich world populations have been dealt with.
So sorry, Raj, what are you saying? That you would mandate generic production of vaccines by other suppliers?
What
do that at cost?
What I would like to see, and I think this aligns very well with what the WHO has been proposing for the last 18 months, is that the vaccine manufacturers really allow licensing to work, whether it's voluntary or compulsory, let's not go into details at this point, but really allow licensing to work. So they get paid for each shot, but the production happens at a rate and pace that's needed. So we know that there are very competent vaccine producers in Canada, Korea, Rwanda, South Africa, who have not been allowed to produce the vaccines. And that's really unacceptable.
Roger, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I'd like to ask my colleague Lara Spirit. Lara, I know you're trying to... Are you? That's so impressive. Oh, and then Matt too. Which one first? Lara, do you want to go? Matt first?
I don't want to chat.
Are you doing? Oh, my, so exciting.
Multitasking here.
Yeah.
What did you want to ask, James?
So I'm sort of intrigued by both these things because on the one hand, as I think we all know, we are running a long campaign, the arms race, kind of vaccine inequality feels to me like one of the most extraordinary scandals in plain sight that I can remember. Yeah. Right? On a global scale, you know, it puts the things that kind of brought tears to our eyes in Ethiopia as a child to shame. There's not the outrage. I think we as a newsroom are outraged. And yet, weirdly, I find myself probably a little at odds with Alex and Raj in that I think to myself, well, are we really going to be able to mandate private companies to sell at a certain cost, or are we going to be able to mandate independent manufacturers to produce the IP of other companies? And so I'm sort of flailing around a little trying to figure out, okay, what is the right way of having equitable vaccine production that respects and understands the rights of shareholders, but meets the needs of a global population?
Well, it was very interesting that you asked about COVAX earlier, because I think where I would slightly differ from Raj is that I don't think the first question to ask is one about supply. A great deal of intellectual and political energy has been expended on the questions of patent waiver. I do agree that licensing should be speeded up, but I think the real problem has been one of power, which is that COVAX is really set up with the sort of infrastructure of a yard sale to deal with 2,000-foot tall giants. There's nothing wrong with COVAX. The people there are incredibly well-meaning, and a lot of them are very expert, but they don't have any political muscle or teeth at all. And so you have big drug corporations, and corporations act like corporations. That's, you know, their software, their culture leads them in a certain direction, which is to maximize shareholder value. And when they come up against COVAX, they have found that it's extremely easy to game the COVAX system, and in particular to do bilateral agreements with countries and bypass COVAX entirely. So from the beginning, there has been no real multilateral force in all of this, saying this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to handle it, this is how we're going to regulate the system of the interface between big pharma and distribution. And as a consequence, the whole thing has really been, with some exceptions, run by the invisible hand. Mm-hmm. So I think that in a funny way, this leads not just to, Kerry's newscast completely nailed the Pfizer question, I think. But the second question this leads to is one that, you know, we've been talking about in the newsroom quite a bit, which is the failures of multilateralism, which is how is it that with this, you know, one of the great scientific miracles of the age happening in 2020, we failed institutionally to respond to the screamingly obvious distributional justice supply questions that were going to arise, with the kind of obscenity that we may end the year with, just to pick out one country, the United States having 1 billion unused spare doses. Now, you can certainly lay some of the blame at the feet of the corporations, but you can't just say it's big pharma being evil. Yeah, that won't get you to an answer. That's not a solution-based approach. What you have to do is say, let's work on the assumption that actually most companies aren't going to act like AstraZeneca. Mm-hmm. Most companies are going to act like Pfizer. how do you regulate
that
how do you deal with that?
internationally.
You know, what are the, and particularly, what are there should be a dashboard, a global dashboard, where when a pandemic happens, certain things are, you know, activated.
Yeah.
And there are multilateral institutions that can do that. And I mean, it was interesting. There was a piece, I think, in the Washington Post the other day, saying that President Biden should use some of his defense powers, national security powers, and all this, which I suspect was partly a thought experiment. But it wasn't a bad one, because, you know, we should be looking at this through the prism of a National Security Council member as much as public health policy officials or business regulators. And I think that, so of course there's been profiteering by Big Pharma, but if this is not just a sort of good versus evil story, it's a story of structural failure.
Well, would you, I agree with a lot of that, and I'm sure Alex, you and Billy may want to come back. Would you just pass the mic to Yelena who's behind you, and then Yelena, will you pass that one on to Lara? I'm going to come to Tess on the screen in a moment, and to Samantha again in a second.
Yeah, I completely agree with Matt in that I think so far we've kind of been talking about the politics and the economics and the incentives of both as though they're separate. I remember reading earlier on this year Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain, which talks about this very eloquently with respect to the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. And what was really interesting there is that you see this turning point in prescriptions and the economic incentive to kind of over-prescribe. And it's interesting, in recent weeks, we've seen in the UK how I believe it's 10% of regular prescriptions are completely unnecessary. And I wonder if we're looking at this from an action perspective, given our political and our moral incentive to be distributing vaccines fairly, whether we could therefore look at putting some kind of financial penalty on vaccine waste. Because there are so many cases in the UK where we see vaccines that are literally getting chucked away at the end of the day because we have too many, or they're being unevenly or poorly distributed. So whether there should be some kind of mandate, whether it's on the political side of things, on the economic side of things, to prevent that kind of waste on a state level, which would therefore incentivize spreading vaccines more equitably.
But Yelena, isn't the problem with that? I mean, that's a sort of turkeys voting for Christmas. I know that we're in a country that's looking for turkeys at Christmas, but we are. But turkeys, in the sense that, in effect, democratically elected politicians are going to say, look, you know, you may not like it, but the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I get more than enough doses for my population. You're not going to punish me if I overshop. And let's put it this way, they're certainly not going to put in place some kind of legislation or self-punishment if they do overbuy. So how would that work?
I agree with you in that it's quite a utopic suggestion on my part. I think the fact that we can't, I think the point I'm making here is that it's easier to market and to sell the fact that we're wasting vaccines to people than it is to sell the truth that we're not safe until everybody is safe.
Yeah, I think that's true. And by the way, I'm close to tears on this subject, because the thing that was amazing was that we thought in July, post-Carbis Bay, when we started in this whole arms race stuff, it's like, this is going to be great. We're going to go around, we're going to say this, no one's safe till everyone's safe, until sort of the beginning of September, get to UNGA, everyone's going to agree, and that'll be that. And actually, the opposite has happened. That whole message has just sort of, hasn't it? It's just drifted into the sand. Sorry, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think we've grappled with this quite a lot here, the kind of chicken egg question of sort of where this all started and what we should be focusing our energies on. I think because we started this in June, we were already at the point where the kind of bad work by pharma had in many ways been done. And it was very much a question of finding and redistributing supply to the places that need it. The other point on COVAX that I think it's quite important to note is that states were complicit in the failure of COVAX, which was obviously a fantastic idea. It's like, you know, Britain were one of the leading voices at the beginning saying that we didn't want to be product agnostic, right? So we were going to be able to choose, which they were. Now, I don't know what Kerry thinks about this, but you could potentially say that maybe Pfizer or maybe other vaccine producers had something to do with that. But it was definitely the case that states themselves have really been driving this policy of unequal vaccine distribution, and we're here sitting on vast surpluses now that we're still refusing to distribute, even when this question of self-interest is over and expired. So it leaves you feeling very hopeless. But I think that kind of domestic, we've discussed this recently, but this kind of finding a way to refocus this on the surplus, on the countries that have these surpluses themselves, is really important. And the suggestion that you made, Helen, I think is fantastic. Somebody else said, and thinking, could we get, our own COVID announcements that PHE or other government officials make include a kind of weekly or monthly update on where we are with distributing vaccines? But again, it's difficult because not enough people care, which is something you said, Liz. It's not enough to make people understand. You've got to make them care too. So we're, I think, as a campaign, facing a number of difficulties on.
But there's an interesting thing, Laura, and this is to your point too, Lena, is when you get to, for example, Canada, right, which I think is, am I right in thinking Canada has the highest hoarding rate?
It has 4 times the number of doses for the population, yeah.
There's no political penalty. I mean, they're the Canadians, right? Like famously the world's nicest people.
But at least Trudeau turned up.
But there's no political penalty at home for that.
No, not at all. And he's able to turn up to Biden summit and show his face, and there be no, people aren't incredulous when he does so, and he can say, I really like the idea of vaccinating 70% of the world's population by hunger next year, and everybody sort of claps and says, yeah, that's great. And nobody's saying, well, this is insane because you're not pledging hundreds of millions of extra doses, which you absolutely could be doing. So I think the kind of that wider failure of multilateralism in this is really important, because there's no shame for these countries when they go to these kind of, summits, etc. They feel quite fine turning up, having given absolutely nothing.
Well, to be honest, it's also amazing that people aren't incredulous that Boris Johnson didn't show up for the summit. I'd say, I don't know which is worse. Actually, I do know which is worse. Not showing up is worse. Billy and Alex, I'm going to come back to you, but I saw Tess Murray has her hand up, and also you've got a fan. Well, I'm trying to get hold of Samantha Pogue, who says you need to listen to a podcast. Billy speaking on this topic is very interesting. So even without listening to the topic, Billy, we're going to ask you, without listening to the podcast, we're going to ask you to comment on it. But Tess, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, hi. I was just reading something, and I wonder if you can guess where it came from, James, which is, our conviction is that companies perform better when they are deliberate about their roles in society and act in the interest of their employees, customers, communities, and shareholders. So when we did Pfizer's War, the first thing I sort of looked at was the top 10 shareholders in Pfizer. And then I had a little nosy about their ESG policies. And BlackRock is the largest shareholder in Pfizer. I'm on page about 723 of their stewardship policy. And I'm not seeing much that matches up to Pfizer's behavior. So when it comes to, sorry, I'm cooking supper, I'm in my pinny. When it comes to the mismatch between ESG reporting, expectations, and behavior, there is a very big gap there that I think is really interesting. And as we always say, with these things, you follow the money. So where is the pressure for good behavior and appropriate pricing and reasonable going to come from?
But Tess, can I just go back to can I just go back to the original, because you worked in this world, right? So you know it far better than I do. I don't know what you would reasonably say to BlackRock, right? Because we're not saying these people have done a terrible thing, right? We're saying these people have done a wonderful thing, right? They've created an extraordinary vaccine under unbelievable time pressures on an entirely new technology, and managed to distribute it to hundreds of millions of people and saved, you get the picture. Yeah, so it's hard to really give them a kicking. The question is, what is a reasonable level of profit? And BlackRock could quite understandably come back and say, look, unfortunately, that's not a reasonable question for us. We invest to see, to maximize shareholder returns.
Yeah, but it is now, purpose is not just a buzzword in the corporate world. I think what I would come back with, and if I could get into the boardroom with Pfizer, what I would be asking them, or if I could get into the room with the shareholders, is, at what price profit and the reputation, So your point is they make stuff, they make money. That's capitalism. That's fine. We're all grown-ups. We know that works. But the effect that, as we discovered through Kerry's podcast, is when you have really deeply inappropriate corporate behavior, misinformation being spread, that leads to a hesitancy about your competitors' vaccine from which you benefit, that leads to drops in vaccination rates in Australia. That goes beyond. That is not just, responsible long-term capital being put into generating a profit stream for a company. That is appalling behavior. And that must sit at odds with any shareholder's idea of what a company's role is. And kind of at some point, you know, that is a very difficult question for a shareholder to justify the returns off the back of behaviour which is unacceptable.
All right. I'm going to do, given we're sort of running out of time, I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Alex and Billy for their thoughts. Charles, I'm going to do something very unfair, which is play the Times leader trick on you, which is to ask what you would actually say if you thought you were going to try and square all of this. But I'm going to bring in, but you're going to get a moment to think about it first, because I'm going to bring in Raj and Kerry. Raj first.
Fascinating discussion. I think I totally agree with Tessa's point about what investors should be doing, particularly those who claim to be interested in long-term responsible investing. Actually, we don't need to go as far as BlackRock. Baillie Gifford has, which is a very large UK-based fund manager, has 11% of Moderna. Moderna benefited from, I think, $6 billion of US government funding. So we can be quite legitimately wondering why global economic performance is being undermined for the benefit of two or three company share price. It's not really a good idea for a diversified investor. And James, this is where I think we have to have a kind of historical perspective. If you look back to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the industry was totally against the supply of generics with a whole series of apparently plausible reasons. 10 million Africans died before generics became available. More would have died had campaigners not. And so all power to your elbow, because I think without that campaign pressure, the pharma companies and their investors are not going to act in time.
Raj, thank you. Kerry.
What's been fascinating about this is that we started out, and I think we still do have a problem of degree, profiteering versus profits. And yet when we're looking for solutions that match the problem, that deal with degree rather than the fundamental, we're not sure what they are. So you know, Matt, it's really interesting to hear Matt D'Ancona, you know, raise that editorial that talked about possibly Biden enacting military powers to deal with that. That's again, that feels like a binary approach rather than a question of degree. When I talked to people in the World Health Organization and in COVAX, it was interesting that they'd sort of given up on multilateralism as well, because when they were looking for who might sort this out, they were looking to shareholders, they were looking to board members of Pfizer and Moderna to rebel against company policy, to again bear down on the degree of the profits that were being made. And so I think what we're looking for at the end of this is what the mechanism is that separates profiteering from profit, that does separate in the end the level of profits that Pfizer has made that are over and above what its competitive manufacturers have made, and how do we identify what the gap is? I think it's more than the gap between $1.19 and $26, but how do we identify the gap? How do we work out what the public funding element has been in the history of the development of these vaccines, what the return on that should be, and then how do we, you know, how on earth do we figure out a fair price in the middle of that?
I mean, it's exactly that. Alex, do you have, I know you've kind of got, okay, here are lots of the problems. Do you have a version of what you think the solution should be?
Yeah, I'd like to just quickly on the ESG investor point. The other day, quite a large UK investor sent me their ESG report for one of the companies we've been talking about tonight. And on the ESG rating, it was described as unacceptable. And on the recommendation, it was recommended as buy. And
yeah,
that
amazing.
Dissonance between those two things kind of summed everything up for me.
Alex, out of interest, the ESG, the overall ESG rating was unacceptable.
Yep.
And the same.
And the recommendation
was
to the broker was buy. So that just shows the dissonance between those two things for me, that on the ESG point. But to the point on pricing and what a fair price is, so much of this could be driven by the market. We had a reference earlier to the invisible hand and being driven by the invisible hand, but Adam Smith was no fan of monopolies, and this is what we have at the moment. We have a very small number of companies who control the market, ironically funded by governments to have that monopoly and given that monopoly by governments. And you said earlier I wanted the price to be set at $1.19 of the pharmaceutical companies. That's not actually my or our position. We want to encourage more companies to come in who will then be able to produce the vaccine, and then competition
Like
within
Roche,
the marketplace.
Yeah.
The only way of doing that is to enforce an IP and technological sharing through the World Health Organization and through the World Trade Organization to do that. So I'm not suggesting that we set a mandatory price as something that a university has come up with a price. I'm saying that in the same way that during how vaccines are reduced in prices, like pneumonia has been reduced because the Serum Institute started producing it. It went down from, I think it was like $50 or $60 down to $3. Mentioned earlier the AIDS crisis. In the same way, drugs getting down from sort of $10,000 to $20,000 a year down to $50 or $60.
Yeah.
Those sorts of competition within the marketplace will drive down the prices, and not only that, it will mean that countries like South Africa, who have an mRNA facility ready to go, like Bangladesh, like Israel, like Canada, could start producing those vaccines, which would ensure that vaccines go across the world and aren't hoarded by a small number of countries. And I just say that the big difference in this discussion is, on the one side, we've been talking about donations and giving our charity to poor countries. I think I'd like to encourage people to maybe have a slightly different viewpoint and thinking, wouldn't it be great if the technology that we have we've developed here isn't something that we give out as charity, but is something which countries around the world, or middle, high-income countries, are all able to use themselves. And that's the sort of the shift in mindset I'd love to see. And if I was at the Pfizer boardroom, I'd be making that same case.
And my dream, I should say, is that actually there's a world in which people in the Pfizer boardroom talk to people like Oxfam and vice versa. That would be a good start. Billy, let's try to get towards an optimistic note. Is there a version in which essentially the global health crisis of the pandemic forces something close to what Alex is describing, a change around market rules that do encourage, even force, greater competition?
Possibly, I think, is maybe the most optimistic I could be on that. I think, echoing what others have said, this is ultimately about a power imbalance in those negotiations. You're never going to get a global agreement on a precise, fair price for a given dose. But clearly, a fairer price is one in which that power is better balanced. And I think I would actually apportion a lot of blame to government, in rich Western governments, in agreeing to buy these vaccines early on at these high prices without really trying to negotiate on price, without adding any conditions, without attempting to leverage the public funding that had already gone into them and for the technology underneath. What might change in future is, maybe in an optimistic version, more international collaboration, or probably more realistically, countries having facilities of their own to develop these products to manufacture them themselves. If the UK's manufacturing centre had been built already when the pandemic hit, they could have started making AstraZeneca, what became the AstraZeneca vaccine, as soon as the Oxford researchers had developed it, and there wouldn't have been that delay, and they wouldn't have had to cede it over to a pharmaceutical company, albeit in that case one which has behaved much more honourably than most of the others.
Okay, that is actually quite optimistic. Yeah, I don't know how hard it was to get there, Billy. Giles, okay, I'm excited by this.
So I'd start by saying an amazing thing's happened here. Big Pharma have delivered vaccines that have brought the pandemic under control where everything else in the rich north failed. Profit made it happen, or helped make it happen. We're not out to reinvent capitalism, but, so we've reached the end of the first paragraph. The industry lost its way when it stopped following the money and when it stopped following the science and started only following the money, to Billy's original point. And COVID has exposed the bad as well as the good, profiteering that could and should have been stopped by governments saying no, again, as just mentioned, and dirty tricks that could and should be punished in courts. I don't know if that, I mean, I can quite see a civil suit, if not a criminal one, eventually from the argument that Kerry exposed. So what do? We have to call Big Pharma's bluff on purpose, to Tess's point, and the industry needs to return to its glory days when, for its own good as well as ours, it followed where the science led, not just cheap, jacking up the price of generics. And there was going to be a clever ending that plugged our investigative reporter. Again, back to Billy's thesis. But I forget exactly what the clever ending was. There we go.
Teasing. I think let's say that. Yeah, that's right. Well, I think let's say that. That's, I think, what we now think. That seems like a good point. I'll add two thoughts, which is, I said at the beginning, a really good thinking. You come away with a story or a lead on a story. I'd also like to say I came away with two, actually. One is this thing that Kerry said, which I do think we keep pursuing, which is this transparency story. It's just amazing to me you don't know the price. I mean, and I really respect the kind of trawl that you're doing, Alex, which is kind of, EU leaks, etc. But you should be able to knock on the front door and say, could you tell us the price that you're paying for our doses of vaccine? And it feels to me as though that will then get you to quite a lot of the points you're making, which is how would you then get to greater market competition? And also, Billy, yours about how would you use the consumer power of large populations. And so I think that transparency is one. But actually, the thing that I'm really excited about, which is pathetic, is, and this is for you, Tess. Tess said to me the other day when we were talking about the Kerry's Pfizer's war, we should go after the investors. And I haven't heard a really, really neat way of going after that. But if we could do a great look at companies where the ESG recommendation is don't, and the House recommendation is do, right? That would be a fantastic expose of the sort of window dressing of ESG and those firms where it happens. So, as is often the case, there will be a little chat after this thinking. We're just going to Alex going, okay, so who was it? So we'll find out who that is. Listen, a big thank you to Raj for joining us. I'm really sorry that Fatima Hassan couldn't join us, but we'll try and make sure that, her thinking is sort of woven into ours. Kerry, very good to see you. Thanks everyone for joining at home. A big thank you to everyone who's come into the newsroom. A huge thank you to Alex. It's a vast improvement on that pointless Max. And great to see you again, Billy. And congratulations on the book. If you're a Tortoise member, do come and pick one up. Thank you very much and have a very good evening. Bye.